treatment and consultation, but also educating. And this is a big passion of mine. So I hope that you can learn something from this presentation, and please ask questions at the end of the presentation. Give me a call, email me. We're all in this together. And on that line, I'd like to put a big thanks to Rick Plesh for organizing a lot of this, but also doing his pivotal part in really improving the plants of this county. He does such a good job, not just with the trees, but all of the perennials and annuals. He does a great job, and he's got a great client base and a great team he works with. So thank you, Rick. And then also a huge thanks to my wife for putting this together and really making my business look professional. So thanks, honey. Any other last things? Yeah, and again, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll talk about that later. But for now, I'm just going to jump in. So let's see if I can do that. There we go. Expectations for this presentation. I want you to be able to tell the difference between a sick tree and a healthy tree. I also want to give you an idea of some of the challenges our trees face in this county in the Southwest Colorado. And we're going to talk about pests and diseases, but also abiotic challenges like salts and alkaline soils and all that good stuff. I also want to introduce you to integrated pest management. This is a holistic plant healthcare approach that I use to think about how I can boost tree health, but also diagnose and figure out a solution for some tree diseases and pests. And then finally, I want to give you some tools that you can walk away with and know that you're doing the right thing for your tree. So this is a huge topic. It should be, like 5 series of lectures, but we're just going to blow through it. I'm going to not spend too much time on any one thing. If you have questions, ask them later, or we can talk about it at another time. Okay, to begin, let's talk about growth increments. A growth increment is the amount that your tree grows in 1 year, and trees grow from the terminal bud. Great, I have a cursor. So trees have a bud scale that they form in the fall and in the winter, and they put a bud within that bud scale. The bud scale is just protecting it. And within that bud are all the cells that are going to be present for the next year's growth. In the spring, when that bud scale falls off and the bud breaks, the bud and twig elongates, and it elongates by infusing all of those cells with water, and it swells those cells and it grows in that way. So if you give your trees a lot of water in the spring and they have good late winter moisture, it's going to grow more. And so that's a really important concept, and we can talk about that later. But what I want you to know is that when your bud breaks and it elongates, it leaves a little scar. That scar is called the bud scar. And we see a good example right here. This is the bud scar, and this is the new growth. And then this is the bud from in the fall when it forms bud. So you can measure that distance. You get an idea of how much your tree is growing. If your tree is growing less than 1 inch in a year, your tree's not doing very well. If it's growing more than 4 inches, your tree's doing moderately well. If it's growing more than 12 inches, your tree's really rocking. You don't have to worry about your tree. Let's look more closely at bud scales and bud scars. This is another example of a bud scar. So this is where a bud used to be. It's opened and the shoot has elongated, and it's left a little scar. It's not so obvious as this on certain species, but sometimes it's really obvious. Now, these diagrams over here is a bit messy, but this gives you an idea of how trees grow and how branches branch out and growth habits form. Now, again, they're not always like this, but this gives you an idea. So let's just say that this brown arrow is the first year's growth. It sets buds. This is the terminal bud, and this is a lateral bud. And then the next year, those buds break and a new growth emerges. So that's the second year. We come down here, now the second year is in brown, and it's set bud. And then those buds are going to break, and this is now the third year's growth. So what you can do when you really get this down is you can walk up to a tree, see what it grew last year, see what it grew the year before, and then even the year before. Now, before 3 years ago, it gets a little tricky. But if you get an idea of what the past 3 years have been for your tree, you're going to get a pretty good picture of if it's healthy now. Is it healthy now compared to what it was last year? Is it recovering from maybe transplant shock? So this is a huge diagnostic tool that anybody can use. This is a real life example of terminal growth increments. This is a black huckleberry. It's never this obvious, but I saw this and I thought this is a great example. So all of this bright red growth is the most recent year's growth. So this one's growing maybe 8-10 inches a year. It's doing just fine. Now on conifers, you can tell this too. And the most obvious way to tell is looking at the terminal leader, the central leader. This guy's got his hands on it. And if you can tell from where the last branches were all the way to the tip, that's this year's growth, or depending on what time of year, that's last year's growth. And so this thing is just rocking. This is like 2 feet of growth. Now, if you look at lateral buds, they also do similar things. In the spring, the buds break. It's pushing out its foliage and its shoot. And this on this tree, the foliage is bright green, usually in the spring and early summer. And so it's pretty obvious. And on this one, this lateral branch, this is later in the summer, but you can still tell that this is pretty green wood. It hasn't lignified yet. So this is the most recent growth. We're looking at the shoot length. And then with conifers too, you can look at the needle length, and that gives you another clue into, is this tree getting enough water? Is it stressed? What's going on? So that you can definitely look at conifers in the same way. These are examples of small growth increments. If you're seeing stuff like this on your tree, you know you have a problem. Don't be shocked if you have a newly planted tree in your landscape and you're seeing this. It takes a long time for trees to recover from transplant shock. So you might see this for a few years, but if your tree is not new and you're seeing this, you might want to be concerned. There is an exception to this rule. Epicormic shoots are these vertical, some people call them water sprouts, and it is a reaction that your tree's making to some sort of stress response, whether that's over pruning, such as topping in this picture, or there's some sort of disease that's dying back the branch tips. Your tree is trying to send out a second wave of branches. It's using a lot of resources to do this. Those branches aren't well connected to the main trunk. So that's one reason that topping is so bad, is because these branches are prone to failure and it gets really overly thick. It's just not good structure. So you want to prevent this as much as possible. Now with especially apple trees, when you prune them pretty heavily, they do this, and that's okay. You want to thin this out and you want to think, what do I want to be a permanent branch, and remove all the rest. But again, if you're seeing this, this doesn't abide by the growth increment rule. This is a sign that maybe your tree's not doing so well. Let's just quickly review growth increments. Again, if you have less than 1 inch in growth increments, that's not good. Your tree's sick. If you have more than 4 inches, your tree's doing really well, or it's doing pretty well. If it's over 12 inches, your tree's doing really well, and you don't need to worry about it. The next diagnostic tool I use, and it's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, is the foliage. Does your tree have a lot of leaves? And let's just jump into a little plant physiology talk. Leaves are, I like to think of them as the wick of the tree. So water gets taken up through the roots, and it gets translocated into the stem, and then through those xylem vessels, it gets translocated up to the leaves. Your leaves have little holes in them where the atmosphere, especially around here, is so dry that it draws water out of the leaves, and it drives this whole process. So if you have a lot of leaves and you have a really dry summer like we do here, your tree's not going to be able to take water up quick enough to feed those leaves. So what does your tree do? It does a couple things. It can regulate how much water it loses through stomata. It can close those stomata, but it can also shed leaves. And that's what you see a lot around here is you see your tree shedding leaves to compensate for that water loss. And you also see trees adjust to root loss, such as root pruning, when they've been dug or they've been transplanted and then they've had some sort of root damage, they'll shed leaves. So knowing that, let's just look at some trees. So these trees have lots of leaves. Think of all those leaves as tiny little wicks. They're losing water. The water's coming in through the roots, up through the vessels, and out through the leaves. These trees don't have as many leaves. So what does this mean? That means they're not getting as much water up to that canopy. Now, there could be a couple reasons for this. It could be a root thing where it's not able to take up the water. It could be a xylem thing where it's not able to transduct that water up the tree. And then finally, it could be a leaf thing, but most likely not. And then if it is, you can usually detect whether herbivores are in your tree. This over here, this is an example of a tree reacting and shedding leaves. This could also be freeze damage. It can be hard to tell, but this is kind of what you want to look for. Like, oh, my tree's thinning out. It's abandoning certain leaves. This is a telltale sign. I mean, look how thick this is versus this. There's something going on here. And then finally over here, this looks like a newly planted tree, and it's probably had some root damage or something. And so what it's doing is it's thinned out, it's collapsing into itself. It's probably going to send out some of those epicormic shoots. But I can tell here that not only this tree, but this tree is pretty thin. So it hasn't quite recovered. It doesn't have all that water transducting ability. Conifers are the same way, and conifers can be really easy to look at because they have they keep their leaves year round. In fact, they keep their leaves for several years. Only when the leaves are 5, 8 years old do they shed them, and that is dependent on the species. So a spruce tree like this can keep its leaves for 5 to 7 years, and so I can see, okay, this is this year, that's 1, and then it's hard to tell, but maybe this is 2 years, 3 years, and then you can count back to 7 years. And if it has 7 years of leaves, your tree is not water stressed at all. It's getting as much water as it needs. Whereas if I know that the spruce should have 7, but it only has 3 years of leaves, it's shed off 4 years of leaves. That means it's not getting enough water. And let's take a look at some pictures. So this is a really good example up here. If you pulled all those needles off, which they're dead, they're not doing anything, you might as well pull that off. You'll see that this tree only has 1 year's worth of needles left on it. And so that means that this tree is shedding a lot of needles because it can't handle the water load. So there's something going on here. There's some root damage or xylem damage. Same with these over here. It's shedding needles. This looks like it only has maybe a couple years of growth on it. And here, same thing. Now, there's an exception to this too, of course. Fall needle cast. Like I was saying, these trees will hold on to 7, but with some trees, it's 3 years of needles. But in order to make room for the next year, they have to shed the previous year. So every fall they do this. They shed those older needles because older needles are the least efficient. They've been around so long that they've succumbed to radiation and free radicals and things like that. So they've had damage. So a tree is always trying to shed the old needles first. And that's an indicator. If you see shedding from within the canopy, you know that the tree is doing it. If you see shedding from the outside in, you know that something else is doing it, because a conifer never wants to shed new needles. Those are precious to the tree. Now let's talk about the deep green aspect of foliage. So if your tree is not deep green, it has some yellow color or orange, there could be something wrong. And a lot of times, especially in Cortez and Montezuma County, it's a nutrient deficiency. This general term for yellowing of the leaves is chlorosis, And basically what it means is your tree doesn't have enough chlorophyll and what chlorophyll does is it absorbs all of the colors in the light spectrum except green. It emits green, and so that's what you see. So if you're seeing other colors, there's something going on, such as in the fall, there's a change in the pigments, and there's the chlorophyll is being reabsorbed, those nutrients. So in the fall, you get exhibited different colors. But if you're seeing this in not fall, in the spring and summer, there's probably a nutrient deficiency, and a couple of key nutrients involved in chlorophyll and photosynthesis is magnesium. This is actually a pigment molecule from chlorophyll, and you can see magnesium is the backbone to it. So if you have a magnesium deficiency, you're not going to have adequate chlorophyll. Iron is really crucial for electron transport chain. It's pivotal in the photosynthesis process. And iron is probably the number one reason we have chlorosis in our county. And it's not because our soils don't have these nutrients. It's that our soils are so alkaline that they hold on to these nutrients like opposite magnets attract. These nutrients are ions. They have a polar charge, and they're opposite of what the soil has. And so the soil doesn't want to let them go. In the East, they have acidic soils. They don't have this problem. These iron and magnesium molecules just are let go of really easily. So East Coast trees, you plant them out here and they can't pull them from the soil, whereas our native trees can do this. They have adaptations that actually change the pH of the rhizosphere around the roots, or they have other adaptations that allow them to take up these nutrients. Now you can deal with this, you can treat these trees, it can be difficult, but you can get a chelated iron, which is down here. You don't want just any source of iron, you want chelated. Chelated means it's prepackaged so that it's not going to be attracted to the soil and your tree is going to be able to take it up. So you want chelated iron. Okay, let's just review foliage now. So you want abundant foliage. That means you're getting a lot of water from the roots up the stem to the leaves. That's good. You want to retain as much of the older leaves or needles as possible. And that goes for conifers and deciduous trees. And you want those leaves to be deep green. Now, there are various shades of green, but you want them to be fairly deep. You don't want them to be yellow. Okay. That was that. Now we're going to talk about pests and diseases that we have in Southwest Colorado. Before we jump into that, I want to clear up some terms that I'm going to use. Infestation versus infection. Infestation is when you have an insect or an arthropod. Now, an insect is an arthropod, but there are other bugs and pests that fall into the arthropod class that are not insects. So I'm going to use the term arthropod here, okay? So when you have an arthropod in residence, in numbers that is not, doesn't make your tree happy, that's an infestation. Whereas an infection is a microbial disease. So that's a viral disease or a fungal disease or a bacterium or something like that. Then we have biotic versus abiotic disorder. Biotic meaning it stems from some sort of life disorder, like a viral disease or a bacterial or a pest. It's something that's living that's actually affecting your tree. Whereas abiotic is a non-living aspect. So nutrient deficiency or drought stress or compacted soils or not getting enough oxygen to your roots. That's biotic versus abiotic. That's kind of important. And then death spiral is something that we talk about a lot. And it talks about you have one factor that's causing some sort of decline in your tree. And usually it's an abiotic disorder, such as, let's say you try to plant an East Coast tree out here in the Southwest soils. It's not getting the nitrogen. It's not getting enough photosynthesis. It's weakened. And then you get something else that takes advantage of that weakened tree. And overall, it declines slowly. And that's called a death spiral, a downward spiral. And that's how trees usually die. It's one thing that leads to another. So I go, a lot of times I'll go diagnose a tree and I'll see, it died from a bark beetle, but really it died from water stress. I hope that makes sense. let's jump into some things that I see a lot around here. And if you can remember a couple of these, it's really going to help you because we see these a lot in Montezuma County. The first one is twig beetle. And it is a beetle. It is an actual beetle, a coleoptera, that is affecting the twigs of pinyon pines. Now you have, in the arboricultural industry, we use a lot of broad terms. You have twig beetle, you have bark beetle, and that is just a term used to describe what it is. It's a beetle of some sort and how it behaves. So it affects the twigs. So you have ash twig beetle, or you have bark beetle. You have bark beetle on pinyon, but those are going to actually be different bugs than bark beetle on ponderosa. And usually these beetles are host specific, not always, but usually. So we have twig beetle on pinyon, and it creates this flagging, or it looks like, oh, there's brown flags in the tree. And it allows you to say, okay, that tree probably has something. Then you go and you look, and you can pretty easily find these twig beetles. And this is decimating our pinyon pines in Montezuma County. And then you have bark beetle, and we have mountain pine beetle that's affecting ponderosa, and you have Ips beetle that's affecting pinyon. And both of these insects, the damage that they do is they actually penetrate the bark. They tap in, they penetrate the phloem, and they go into the xylem a little bit, but they stay kind of on the outside in that cambial area. And the adult that penetrates goes and carves a little tunnel, and at certain points in that tunnel, it lays eggs. Those eggs will eventually hatch. The larvae then form these galleries, these meandering galleries. And depending on how the galleries are shaped, you can diagnose exactly what kind of mountain pine beetle that is. And then those galleries are actually doing a lot of damage and girdling the tree. They eventually pupate and they emerge as adults, but they've done their damage through the galleries. They're girdling the tree, but they're also introducing a fungus. And the fungus is what actually spreads and kills all those xylem layers that kill the tree. So it's a bit of a combination there. What you're looking for when you're trying to find bark beetles is you're trying to find this frass. Now, frass is a mixture of like little sawdust and excrement mixed with pitch. If the frass is brown like it is here, that means your tree unsuccessfully tried to pitch out the beetle. If it's white, that means it successfully pitched it out and it's kind of flushing the system, and you just see white resin. Okay, so that was beetles, and this is borers. Borers are different than beetles in that borers actually lay their eggs on the outside of the tree in little cracks in the bark and stuff. The larvae hatch, and then the larvae penetrate into the bark, and they do their thing and usually they go a little bit deeper than the cambial layers. They go into the xylem and actually into the heartwood, and they tunnel and they chew and they grow. And then eventually they'll pupate and come out as adults. And when they emerge, they have different shaped holes. They can have oval or D-shaped holes. This is a very D-shaped hole. And so it helps you diagnose what it is. But the thing about borers is they don't have the extensive gallery forming in the cambial layers like beetles do. They kind of do work on the inside in the heartwood. So they do two things. They can actually weaken your branches quite a bit so that they'll split there, but they also don't girdle your tree entirely. And especially if it's a deciduous tree, it can react to that. It can occlude those wounds and it can survive. So you can treat borers pretty easily. It still is doing damage, but you can treat borers, except when it introduces a fungal pathogen such as the poplar borer, often introduces cytospora. Now you can still treat poplar borer, but when you start to see stuff like this, then you know that that wound that it's created has been occupied by some sort of fungal pathogen, and that's kind of it. So that's borers in a nutshell. Then you have scale insects, and these little buggers are tough to deal with. The good news is they don't usually kill your tree, but they do weaken it. In fact, if you drive up and down Montezuma Ave in Cortez, you'll see a lot of this if you look closely. The American elms in this part of the country are inundated with European elm scale. It's an introduced species. And what these elms do is they have a waxy covering that protects them from environmental stresses such as insecticides. So I can't just go spray these things and kill them. They're so protected. Um, Luckily, they have a life stage that's really vulnerable. So eventually they need the little eggs hatch from underneath mama's shell, and they need to crawl along the branch and find new territory and new a feeding source. And that's when they're vulnerable, the crawler stage. So then you can hit them. So with this insect, it's all about timing. So again, this isn't going to kill your tree, but it's severely going to weaken your tree. And you want to try to treat this as well as you can. Now, there are products that actually, and we'll talk about these later, that get taken up by the tree systemically. So you just water the roots or you just spray it on the trunk, and it gets infused into every cell in the tree. And when that bug, that shell, oyster shell scale or European elm scale tries to either tap into the phloem in the case of the European elm scale, or it tries to chew on cells like the oyster shell scale, it takes in that insecticide and it kills it. Unfortunately, resistance has established itself in these populations. So those aren't really working anymore. Too bad, huh? And then we have, so that was infestations. That was just a quick overview of some things that we see. Now we're going to talk about infections, and these are microbial pathogens. The first one on the left over here, this is Cytospora canker. Cytospora canker. Now, trying to decide what type of fungal pathogen it is can get really complicated because they have different life forms depending on if they're in a sexual phase or asexual. So broadly, we call this family of fungal pathogen Cytospora canker, and it has a huge number of hosts. A lot of your fruit trees, this looks like a peach tree, they get it really bad, and they exude these gummy exudates called gummosis, and that's an indicator that your tree has Cytospora. Now, it's not going to kill your tree in this case, but it's going to weaken it, and your tree's going to just slowly decline. So it's really important to focus on what you can do to boost your tree's health. Over here, we have Cytospora again, but this is on aspen. And you can see that all of these vessels, everything under here has been infected. All of that is dysfunctional. It's not transpiring water up to the canopy. So it's probably going to die now. It could hold on for a number of years using these healthy vessels. Eventually, it's going to girdle the tree and it's going to kill it. So Cytospora, you see it everywhere. Fire blight. Fire blight is primarily on apples, but a lot of members of the rose family. You see it on serviceberry and hawthorns, and it's a bacterial infection that essentially does the same thing. It ends up invading those living xylem layers and killing them. So you want to look for stuff like this, blackened, almost like it's been fire burnt, like fire blight in the leaves and the flowers. And we'll talk about what you can do to prevent this. Quickly, some other stresses that we see. And it sounds so cliche, but road salts, it's still something that you see a lot of damage from. Trees growing, and even native trees growing right along roads. If you start to look, and now that you have the eyes, you're looking for foliage and you're looking for greenery, you'll see that a lot of these trees along the roads are getting hit by things like road salts and just general pollutions. Herbicide damage, I still see a lot of 2,4-D drift. Improper irrigation, whether that's watering too much, watering not enough, watering too frequently, but not enough. You don't want to be watering every day. You want infrequent long soaks, and we'll talk about that. Compacted soils. Compacted soils means that your tree roots don't have anywhere to go, but also there's no oxygen in those roots or in those soils. Compacted soils can be a big problem. We talked about alkaline versus acidic soils already. Construction damage, you're not only compacting the soils, but you're actually, I see a lot of ripped branches, which that's just opening wounds for infection. Improper pruning, you're spreading fire blight, you're spreading Cytospora, and planting too deep. This is a picture of somebody who watered a little too much. Integrated pest management. So what do I do, and what can you do to help your trees? I want to introduce this idea of integrated pest management, IPM. It is kind of a methodology that smart people came up with for thinking about how can we do this in a systematic way that we're not missing anything, and we're doing it in the least harmful way possible, least harmful to the environment, least harmful to beneficial insects, and least harmful to you. And so there's three aspects. There's biological, cultural, and chemical. We'll get into those one at a time here in a second. Before I do that, I want to talk about plant healthcare. Plant healthcare is implementing IPM, but it's also inspecting your tree. It's analyzing it and diagnosing it, and then eventually it's treating it. And so I am a plant healthcare specialist. So different components of IPM. Let's start with cultural practices. And cultural means that you're actually changing the culture, the little environment of your tree. Water. The biggest thing you can do for your trees is water them correctly and adequately. So what you're doing when you're watering your tree is, we talked about, you're getting water from the roots to the leaves, where the leaves use that water to produce photosynthates, or sugars. And then those sugars can be allocated to different parts of the tree and different causes. So your tree can either allocate sugar to defense, it can allocate it to growth, or it can allocate it to reproduction. Now, if you're worried about defense and protecting your tree, your tree uses these sugars to make different organic compounds. And basic terms, there's terpenes and phenolic compounds that will deter insects from chewing on the tree, or will actually be used in this case to push the insect out. This is resin, which is emitted from pitch cells. And so the more sugars that your tree is able to make, the more it's going to be able to defend itself. So it's all about making sure your tree is photosynthesizing as much as it can. So if your tree gets drought stressed, it's actually going to start shutting down these layers of xylem. And what that's doing is, once you've shut down a layer of xylem, you can never have it back. So a lot of these trees, will get good winter moisture, and a lot of these pinions, or I'm looking out and I'm seeing junipers right now, they've shut down so many of their xylem vessels that even if they get a lot of water, you only have a couple layers of xylem transmitting that water up. So you're not going to get as much water from the roots to the leaves. So you want to keep those water columns intact. Another thing that watering your tree does, and this is more for deciduous trees, is your plant cell uses water to expand that cell, fill the cell, and your tree, the leaves are going to be pushed flat where they can optimally photosynthesize and capture the sun's energy, and that's called turgor pressure. So if your tree is flaccid and the leaves are flaccid, it's not photosynthesizing optimally. So you want to water your trees to increase that turgor pressure. How much to water? Great question. There's a lot of rules of thumb. It's so variable, but let's just look at what CSU has to say. And I took this from their website. They recommend 10 gallons per caliper inch every 2 weeks. So if your tree is 4 inches in diameter, and this is diameter breast height, then you want to water 40 gallons slowly at one time, and then wait 2 weeks and do it again. Now, there's still a lot of debate. In fact, there's some recent studies that have come out that a newly planted tree needs completely different watering schedules. Think about it, a newly planted tree, you've pruned all those roots off, whether in the planting process or the digging process. And I mean digging, when you actually take it from the nursery and you dig it out of the ground and then you put it in somebody's landscape, you've pruned those roots. So they actually recommend watering every day a little bit. Now, the trees that you buy from Rick or from David Temple at Trees of Trail Canyon, they've kind of gone through their transplant shock, unless they're in B&B. And so I came up with this 5/3 rule. So what I mean by that is you want to put 5 gallons of water for every inch every third day. And I know that's kind of a lot of math, but it's kind of a compromise between what CSU is saying and what some of this new research is saying. Because you don't want to, for a newly dug or planted tree, they're so vulnerable to desiccation and drought that if you waited 2 weeks to water it again, it just wouldn't survive. So I like this 5/3 rule, 5 gallons for every inch every third day. In the wintertime, it's a little different, but just remember your trees need water in the winter. I know I've talked about that on my blog, but ultimately you can always do the finger test. So stick your finger down in the soil as far as you can. And if it's sopping wet down even here, then you don't need to water. If you do water, you're going to deprive your roots of oxygen, and that's going to kill them. So you want to wait until that's dry, and then you want to water again. Now, if you can't even get that far, you need to water. Some things that are going to change this: soil type. If you have sandy soils, you're going to have to water more often. If you have clay soils, not as much. Species type: if it's a native tree, you don't need to water that much. If you're watering your pinyon too much, it will die. These things are adapted to a lot of dry conditions. And then other rules of thumb: when you plant the tree, or I plant the tree with you, think about how big that root ball is. They're 12 inches deep at the least. A lot of times they could be 24 inches deep, and you want to get water all the way to the bottom. And then you want to do that infrequently. So infrequent but deep, long soaks. And what that's doing is that it's encouraging the roots to not be up here at the surface, but to be down here where water is held onto by the soil for a long time. And what that does is it makes your tree more impervious to drought conditions. So if you're watering every day, which a lot of people are watering their lawns every day, all those roots are right at the surface, and they're competing with grass roots. And what happens when your system shuts down in the early fall, late winter, or you have something go wrong? All those roots are right there at the surface where the sun just bakes them dry. So what I'm saying is infrequent, long soaks. And the best way to do this is to automate it. In the Southwest, you just don't have enough time to water your trees as much as they need. Now, in Arkansas or in Louisiana, where it's humid, you could probably get away with watering your trees by hand, because you know what, who cares if you missed a day? But out here, you really got to automate it. And I can't say this enough. I've planted a lot of trees in this county now, and I've talked to David Temple, who's planted thousands of trees, and you have like a 90% success rate if you automate it. If you don't automate it, you have like a 30% success rate. So water or automate your trees, get a drip system. Really, this is the best way. This isn't going to cut it. This is better than hand watering, but it really doesn't cut it. Get a drip system. A lot of times, especially for newly planted tree, planting in a landscaped yard where there's grass isn't going to cut it, because you need deep, long soaks. You need to be very specific to that tree's needs. So get a drip system. And if you have any questions, I can help you. I can coach you through it. I can set it up for you. Okay, we talked about water. Now let's talk about mulch. Everybody knows mulch is good. Why is mulch good? It retains water. When you don't have mulch or any ground cover, the sun desiccates that soil and dries it out like that. Mulch is also good because it recycles those nutrients. The mulch breaks down the arthropods, the fungi, the bacteria in the soil, breaks it down, releases those nutrients to the tree in a way that your tree really likes. If you're throwing artificial fertilizer at a tree, you're kind of breaking that cycle, and your tree it's kind of like giving a tree steroids. Your tree is going to love it, but it's breaking a lot of those natural systems that your tree really thrives on. So you want to, it recycles the nutrients. It decompacts the soil, because when you have all of this biology underneath your mulch working through the soil. You have earthworms going up and down and creating worm castings, and you have millipedes and centipedes. They actually penetrate the soil a lot, and you'll see that it decompacts the soil for you. It takes years, but it can do it. It buffers the temperatures, cool and warm. You got the soil microbes, and it limits competition. In this case, the grass, you'd be surprised. Some of these European grasses, they grow such a thick turf, and they will penetrate even through this bark and take up a lot of the resources that your tree needs. So you can put up to 6 inches of mulch around your trees, and your trees will love it. Other cultural controls that you can do. When you're planting trees, it's best to talk with somebody like Rick or like David Temple and talk about what should I be planting, because they're going to know what is resistant to some of these bugs that we're experiencing in the area. For instance, if you go and plant an American elm, now we've kind of avoided the Dutch elm disease, but if you plant an American elm in certain parts of most of this country, you're going to get Dutch elm disease, your tree's going to die. So that's a pretty extreme example. But other things, you want to plant trees that are adapted to our plant zone. So if you're planting zones from the desert and they come up here, they're not going to be hardy enough to tolerate our freezing temperature. And if you're planting things from the East Coast, they're not going to be able to tolerate our soils, but also some of our dry conditions in the wintertime. So you want to plant resistant and tolerant trees. You want to diversify your garden. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but the more diverse garden, the more arthropods you're going to see in your garden, and the more likely you are to have those beneficial arthropods, because insects have different life stages. And depending on what the life stage is, they're going to feed on different things. They're going to feed on pollen as adults. They're going to feed on aphids as larvae, and stuff like that. So you want a very diverse garden. Sanitation pruning, that means pruning out dead wood and diseased wood. If you have a lot of pinions and you have twig beetle, and one tree is just completely decimated, remove that tree, treat the other ones. That's called sanitation pruning. Proper pruning techniques. I've already talked about this, but your tree has natural defenses within the tree that if you improperly prune, you're not respecting those natural barriers, and you can spread disease. So make sure that you know what you're doing, and you can take a pruning class through Rick, through David, or myself, and you can prune properly, and make sure that you find a tree service that knows what they're doing. It's best to find a tree service that is a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture, ISA. And then soil aeration. This is kind of a soapbox for me. Our soils are compacted. They've been compacted from construction, but they're also clay, so they compact really easily. I think that a lot of our problems is our trees are not getting enough oxygen. So consider aerating your soils. Okay, that was cultural controls. Now we're going to talk about biological controls. And what I mean by biological controls is I mean that there are certain insects that do the work for you. So let's say you have aphid infestation on your cherry tree. There are predators, natural predators that eat those insects. There are parasitoids. And what I mean by a parasitoid is it is usually a wasp or a fly that lays its eggs on the pest. The egg hatches on the pest and penetrates into the pest and consumes the pest from the inside out. It's disgusting, but it's awesome. And that's called a parasitoid. And then there's pathogens, and that's viral, bacterial, nematodes, etc. And so we're just going to look at all of these, just brief examples. Predators. This one, everybody should know what that looks like, what that is. That is a ladybug larvae. Everybody's heard about ladybugs. Well, it's actually they're monster-looking babies that do all the work. They're awesome predators consuming all kinds of things. This is a green lacewing, an elegant little guy, consumes lots of different hosts, but also the larvae are predators as well. So you can buy all of these, but you can buy lacewings on the internet and let them loose in your garden. And then this is a minute pirate bug. It has piercing, sucking mouth parts. And so it goes after things like scales and aphids. So that was predators. This is parasitoids. These are just some examples. This is an extreme example. This is the giant ichneumon wasp. It has an ovipositor or an egg-laying device that penetrates tree bark. It penetrates the tree bark and it lays its eggs within the larvae of a horntail, which is another Homoptera. It's a wasp type thing. The egg hatches in the larvae, consumes the larvae, and then emerges. This is a tachinid fly, looks like a bee. It's actually a fly, and it lays its egg on the side of caterpillar heads. So it lays one egg, and then that egg hatches and penetrates the caterpillar and kills it. It's pretty cool. And then this is a trichogamma wasp. It is so tiny. This is a caterpillar egg, and it lays its egg in another egg. And when that egg hatches, it consumes the egg and it kills it. So these are so microscopic, it's almost impossible to see, but you need to be thinking about trying to cultivate and protecting these beneficial parasitoids. And then finally, there's pathogens. And these are super awesome. They're very useful in greenhouses. Let's say you have an infestation of a caterpillar. You can release, this is a MPV virus. You can release these viruses. This is a fungal thing. Bavaria is a strain of virus, fungal that you can release in your greenhouse. And this is a nematode. You can release these and you can count on the spores of these various things getting distributed through your greenhouse and killing all of the pests. It's amazing. And then a lot of times your pests have multiple generations, and you know what? The spores are still there in your greenhouse. So you'll see multiple generations dying. And over here, this is a really cool one. This is BT. Now, you probably heard of that in Big Ag. And BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, is used to kill hosts, specifically caterpillars. When they consume this, it gets in their gut and it kills them. The thing is it doesn't affect us because our pH of our stomach is completely different. So BT is super awesome. Not only is it very effective, but all of these are very selective, meaning that they affect very specific insects. And then this is a nematode, or a kind of a worm-like thing. You can see what it does. Okay, so that was biological controls. They're being explored more and more in the industry. I hope to use a lot of them in Montezuma County because they're not harmful to non-target pests. They don't harm humans. They're very selective. Okay, so that was biological. Now let's talk about chemical controls. So you can think of chemical controls as the big guns. You bring in the heavy artillery. And you can also think of them as like using antibiotics. Now, when you have a bacterial infection and you take antibiotics for it, you're killing the bad stuff, but you're also killing all of the good flora in your body. When you use certain chemicals, you're kind of doing the same thing. You're killing all the bad stuff, but you're also killing a lot of the good stuff too. Now, you can be fairly specific. You can think about life stages of insects. You can think about timing. You can think about persistence on the tree, and you can try to be as selective as possible. But a lot of times, these are the big guns. The good news is a lot of these products are from natural sources. So pyrethrum is an extract from the chrysanthemum flower, which is this guy over here. All of these plants are amazing at biochemical warfare because you know what? Plants can't move, so they have to come up with ways to defend themselves. Now, we as humans, we take those awesome pathways, we figure out what it is, and we make it synthetically, and then we put it in certain concentrations that they have the desired effect. So pyrethrum is from chrysanthemum flower. Neonicotinoids is getting a really bad rap right now. It can have some really harmful effects, especially on bees, but if used responsibly, it's super effective. And the reason why is because neonicotinoids, or neonics, they act systemically. So all you have to do is spray the trunk from 3 to 6 feet or something, And then it gets absorbed into the trunk and it gets distributed through your whole tree, and it protects the tree for up to 3 years. It's amazing. The problem is people are using neonics. They coat seeds, agricultural seeds, and when that plant emerges, it takes in those neonics and it grows. You have corn plants and soybeans growing with neonics built in, and it's just completely taking over ecosystems. So that, I think, is an irresponsible way to use neonics. But long story short, they can be really useful, and they come from tobacco. They're nicotine. And then there's new products out on the market that are being tested and are being implemented. Anthracyclic diamide insecticides come from this Rionia species, and that's also systemic. It's a potential replacement for neonics. And then there's neem. These are neem seeds up here. You get neem oil, but they have azadirachtin as the active ingredient, and they can be really good as a contact herbicide or insecticide. So I've already talked about some of these concerns, but I want to highlight them. Concerns when you're using the artillery, the big guns, is you want to preserve pollinators. So you don't want to be spraying at times when you have bees out. You can spray early in the morning. You can spray early in the year. You can, and a lot of insecticides are moving away from foliar applications and getting towards tree injections or soil drenches. So you want to think about your pollinators. You want to protect them. You want to think about how can you be as selective as possible, meaning you're only affecting that target organism and you're not affecting non-target. And so you have broad spectrum versus selective. You have target pests versus non-target pests. You want to preserve those beneficial insects. Timing, I've already talked about. There's life stages that insects can be vulnerable during, such as the crawler stage. And then you have thresholds. And I really want to talk about thresholds. So let's say you have an aphid infestation. Now, aphids, what do? They have piercing, sucking mouthparts. They affect leaves, but they affect old leaves, and they have very short lifespan. Now, do you need to spray your whole tree because you have aphids on a few leaves? No, you don't. So that's a threshold that you say, I'm not going to treat my tree until I know that it's severely declining because of this pest. And then that way, the less you spray, the more chances you have of natural predators coming in and taking care of the problem for you. If you kill everything right off the bat, those predators and those parasitoids never have a chance to get established and bloom in population. It's the population cycles. And then least harm ethic. This is part of IPM, and it's part of my personal business model that I want to do as least harm as possible to the environment as I can. Okay, we're almost done, I swear. Defending your trees. This is just a recap. What does a sick tree look like? We talked about growth increments. If it's less than an inch, your tree's sick. 4 inches, it's okay. Over 12 inches, your tree's rocking. We talked about your canopy. Is it thin? Is it off color? If it is, it's probably sick. You might have some damage to those xylem layers. You can kind of look around, think about your soils. Are they getting enough water? Are they getting enough oxygen? Do you have good root health? So that is sick trees. What can you do as a homeowner? Think about IPM. You can look up IPM. Think about the cultural controls. Are you watering enough? Is it the right kind of watering? Are you doing infrequent long soaks? Are you mulching your trees? Is the water staying in there? Nutrient cycling. Are your trees getting enough oxygen? You can always aerate your soils. You can do vertical trenching, and then keep a diverse garden. Think about harvesting and hosting those beneficial insects, and prune out the dead and diseased. That's it, believe it or not. Again, I'm Legacy Tree Solutions. I just started up. Now, it's just me right now. I hire somebody, every once in a while to help me. So be patient with me. I'm very much in the startup phase, but I've already gotten so much awesome support and enthusiasm from you guys. So thank you. Here's my email, or this is my email if you have any questions, my phone number. So I think we're ready for questions.
Great. Thanks, Roman.
Did I go over time? Just a little bit.
I am going to be reading questions from the chat. So if you have questions that you haven't written down yet, go ahead and write them in the chat. Okay, first question is about fertilizer. Can fertilizer create too much leaf?
Great question. So there's a lot of research that's been done with fertilizer, and there's a lot of opinions out there. From the arboricultural industry, they don't recommend fertilizing too much because what that's doing is it's changing the ratio of how much roots to shoots. So how much root it has to how much above ground canopy and shoots it has. And what it does is it encourages the shoot growth, and it doesn't really do much for your root growth. And so your trees have all this biomass up here, but they don't have the nutrients coming in, the water coming in to sustain that. So your trees can get vulnerable. They're also packed with nitrogen, and bugs really like nitrogen. I don't know if I talked about with scale insects, but scale insects, especially the soft scales, they tap into the phloem, but they're looking for nitrogen. And a lot of what they get in the phloem is sugar. So they poop out sugar looking for nitrogen. So if you think about it, if you're giving your tree a lot of nitrogen, you're going to start to see pests arise. The tree's going to be a little bit more vulnerable, and your tree isn't going to establish those symbiotic relationships that they have with fungi and with bacteria. So it's kind of a complicated topic. I think some of our soils in this area, they're so disturbed and they're so new that they don't have a lot of nutrients in them. So there are times when I'll recommend a very basic, broad spectrum fertilizer that has little nitrogen and a lot of little N and a lot of P and K, potassium and phosphorus. And then you want those other micronutrients too. So kind of a long story short, but I hope I gave you some information.
All right, we have a lot of really good questions coming in.
So keep it brief. Okay.
Here's another one. If trees have had bad bark damage from hail, can this affect the xylem functioning and water uptake, or is this usually more surface damage?
I would say it's surface unless you see, bark actually sloughing off. And with deciduous trees, trees can tolerate a lot of damage. I saw, this is a little anecdote, but in David's nursery, he has these prairie dogs that are a problem, and they came and they almost completely girdled the tree. So they chewed off the cambium and the bark on 3/4, if not more, of the tree. And I gave up on the trees. I didn't cut them down, but I thought they were dead. And the trees have totally responded. They're almost completely healed. So if you get a little bit of damage to the bark or to the cambial layers, and the cambium is actually more important than the xylem, because the xylem, there's lots of layers in there. Your tree can be okay. It can respond and recover.
Great. What about rock or gravel mulch?
It's doing half the job. It's protecting your soils from drying out from the sun, but it's not recycling those nutrients. So I highly advise basic arborist mulch. You can get the decorative stuff from the store, but it's more expensive. And if you think about arborist mulch, it has leaves mixed in with it. It's got stems, it's got coarse, it's got fine stuff. So it's going to break down at different rates, and it's going to really feed your soils.
Okay, which borer impacts fruit trees?
There's a couple. There's round-headed apple tree borer. It hits a lot of different trees, not just apple trees, and that's a big one. And then there's a peach tree borer that affects peach trees, and I think some prunus species, so maybe cherries. And both of these, they really hit young, vulnerable, newly planted trees. So once your tree gets established, you're pretty good, especially if it's healthy and you're looking at growth increments. But until then, consider protecting it with a permethrin spray, which has a long persistence, and you spray the bottom 12 inches of your tree. So those are the two ones.
Another fruit tree question. How is Cytospora canker on fruit trees treated?
You can't really. A lot of these microbial infections you can't really treat. Now, what you can do is you can try to boost your tree's health through those cultural practices. There is a product out, and it's kind of crazy. It's a plant growth regulator. And what it does is it tells your tree to focus its energies not on elongation and growth, but on other things like defense. And it's pretty complicated, but it can be effective on fire blight. But long story short, you can't really treat these diseases. Now there are products like antifungal products, but they're they're not all that effective. You're going to have to treat your tree every year. Usually they're injected in your tree, so you're doing damage. Rather plant resistant varieties or try to boost the tree's health. Your tree can still live with Cytospora. Every tree down in David's orchard, his fruit orchard, all those beaches, they have some level of Cytospora. So you prune out the Cytospora and you just try to increase tree vigor.
You're going to love this question. I would like to get your recommendation on using compost tea, comfrey tea on newly planted conifers. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of research on compost tea. I think it's a great idea. There's a lot of research coming out about the beneficial aspects of mycorrhizae and Actinomycetes. I think I'm saying that right. Bacteria. And so the idea that compost tea has all of those things in it, and it has some of their byproducts already. So it's got nutrition, but it's also an inoculant. The thing is from what I've heard, there are different qualities of compost tea. And you really want to make sure that it has living organisms in it. And you do that by looking at it under a microscope. And it's pretty inconsistent. So I'm still deciding. I think it can be used well in conjunction with some organic matter like mulch or leaves. So the debate is still out there. There's also other products that are more scientifically made, like in labs that are, you can think of them more as a probiotic. And so they come, you mix them with water and you just drench the roots. And some of those inoculants I think are more successful, but it's a very complicated topic because you're planting a tree out in the landscape. Now, if you're growing plants in a greenhouse or a nursery where you're not open to the environment, you can have really sterile conditions. In which case, inoculating your roots with something like compost tea or mycorrhizae inoculants can be really helpful, and there's evidence for that. But when you plant a tree out in the wild, those spores are already present, so there's not a lot of evidence that it helps, but I'm not against it.
How might I differentiate the water needs of my lawn and my trees?
They can be the same, but you have to train them. So grasses, they can also tolerate infrequent long soaks, and it's best to do that because if you're watering every day, they're going to need water every day. Whereas if you start, and you want to do this in a gradual succession, if you cut it back to every other day, then every third day, and then I think Rick Flesh waters his lawn once a week. And you know what? He waters it a lot, and he waters it once a week, and so he's able to water his trees and his lawn at the same time. And the answer is grass and trees are living species. They can adjust. They have these fine root hairs that are kind of expendable, and so they can put them here, they can kill them off, put them over here, but it takes them some time. So you can change the watering regimen, but you want to do it slowly.
What is the proper way and timing to dispose of diseased material pruned off trees?
Great question. You want to do it when those pathogens are not active, and that is dry cold conditions. So right now we are pruning fruit orchards because we have those conditions right now. So long story short, prune in like late winter is a great time to prune.
How do I aerate soil where trees have previously been planted without harming roots?
That's another great question. So you want to do a couple different things. You can always start with just a basic lawn aerator. They have a big drum, they have these plugs, and they go through your lawn and they create plugs about that deep. That can't hurt, right? It's increasing surface area and getting oxygen lower. If you want to, if your tree's having problems and you want to get air lower, there's a couple things. You can hire me, and I have a soil probe that what it does is it's a long probe that shoots water, and I'll probably be adding nutrients of some sort, whether it's something like compost tea or there's other products that help trees. I'll be shooting that. And what that water does is it fractures that, and you're creating a pocket where your probe was. And so I create lots of holes in your lawn that go at least 12 inches deep. And not only is the probe, but it's creating these layers, fractured layers in your soil, so it can actually kind of decompact, kind of aerate your soil. You can also get, there's other, so, and then there's vertical trenching. And what that is you're digging not with necessarily a post hole digger, but you're digging vertical tubes. And let's say your tree, it's a newly planted tree and it's not doing well. If you dig vertical tubes and you dig a few of them, sure, you might kill some roots, but you're also getting a lot of oxygen to those roots. And you want to backfill with something like mulch or something like gravel that allows a lot of gas exchange. And so you just dig 4 or 6 of these around your tree will find that air. Again, they're living, they're going to find those nutrients. So it will find those vertical tubes and put roots there. The other thing you can do is radial trenching. And you dig these radial trenches starting from your tree and out, kind of like sun rays. And again, you're going to kill roots, but you're killing as few of them as possible. And another tool that arborists use, and I hope to use this, is you can get an air gun that can excavate the soil around the roots without actually damaging the roots. And so you can create these radial trenches, backfill with some nice aerated compost. And so it aerates the soil and it adds nutrients. So those are some options, but it's not easy.
What is your treatment management protocol for things such as slime flux or bacterial wetwood?
Slime flux and bacterial wetwood. Slime flux is a term used to describe bacterial wetwood. They're the same thing, essentially. Bacterial wetwood is evidence. So what they mean by this is there's oozing a lot of times from like crotches in trees. You see it on cottonwood and elm a lot. And it's evidence that you have a bacterium in your tree. And for certain species, it's an actual bacterium. For other species, it's called bacterial wetwood, but it's actually a fungal pathogen. So back to the bacteria, if it's a bacterium, there's evidence that it's not really harming your tree. In fact, it's not breaking down any of the lignin properties in the tree, and so it's not actually a problem. It's unsightly and it can be smelly, but it's not harming your tree. So you don't really need to do anything. If it's a fungal bacterial wetwood, which is confusing, that can actually have wood decay properties and can spread. And I see it kill, but you're looking at things like willows, like globe willow. I see a lot of that fungal bacterial wetwood, and you can really tell because it smells like brewing beer and it has a lot of white bubbly stuff coming out.
Okay, 2 people actually asked this question. Where can you buy arborist mulch, or can I make my own?
Yeah, you can make your own if you have a chipper, or if you stockpile a bunch of branches and you hire an arborist to, instead of burning things, you hire them to come and chip it. Then now you got a pile of really valuable mulch. The other option is call all the arborists in your area. Montezuma County is tough because I know at least last year or the year before there were a couple of big companies, but they didn't mulch their slabs. They burnt it, so it was hard to find good mulch. Another source could be the dump, and I don't think they have any right now. But what they do is they have a giant pile of tree slash and yard waste, and a couple times a year they actually mulch it all. And they turn a lot of it into compost, but I think a lot of it's for sale as mulch, and you can buy it by the truckload. In La Plata County, you can find it pretty readily. There's a lot of tree services that mulch things. And then the last option is you could probably ask around to the local nurseries. And I don't think Rick has any right now. I might be mistaken. And then I'm not sure if Vic has any at Four Seasons, but I do know that the nurseries in Durango have mulch you can buy.
What can be done to prevent or reduce wind damage to deciduous trees?
Great question. So what you don't want to do is thin your tree. The thought used to be, well, if you're thinning your tree, and there are different types of thinning, but you don't want to take out branches for the sake of just taking out branches and making it look thin, because what trees do is the branches actually hit each other as the wind blows. If you ever see a tree, it's not doing this, it's doing this. And so what those branches are doing is they're hitting each other and buffering each other from the wind. And so there's some really cool research out of Florida that shows that you don't want to thin your tree, you want to let it do its thing. If you have a really mature tree and it's leaning over your house and you're worried about breaking branches from either snow load or wind load, you can take weight off of the tips. And I use the analogy, if your arm is straight out and you're holding a 10-pound weight, and you get really used to that and you get really strong, and then you take the 10-pound weight away, then you're really strong. Then you're used to holding all that weight, but you're not anymore. And trees are the same way. So you can take a lot of the weight out of the tips and make the tree stronger. And I do that a lot if I have a tree growing over structures and it needs to be mitigated for safety. You want to focus on those approaches. You want to make sure you're pruning trees, especially well-established mature trees, from the outside in. You don't want to really take out this interior because, again, that's buffering the wind. You want to take out limbs from the outside in.
Did you say our alkaline soil does not retain iron, causing chlorosis?
Sorry, our alkaline soils have a lot of iron, but the iron is trapped in the soil because it has an ionic property that is attracted to the cationic property. I hope I'm saying this right. The cation, so your soils have a positive charge and your iron has a negative charge, and they're so attracted that they don't want to let go of each other. And certain trees can break that, but a lot of East Coast trees can't.
Okay, last question. For conifers, you mentioned that needle length is a good indicator of growth and how well it's doing. What length do you compare to? How do you know what needle length is a good sign for a conifer?
Yeah, so there's two parts of that. There's the shoot length, which is the new growth of the twig, and then there's needle length, and they indicate different things. Your shoot, first your twig has to grow, and then it sends out needles, right? So your shoot, which comes first, is a sign of late winter moisture. So if you get good snowpack in the mountains, you're going to get good shoot length. Your needle length is a sign of early summer moisture. So if you have really dry conditions early in the summer, it's not actually going to shoot out very long needles or leaves. It's a bit confusing. So what do you compare it to? You can compare it to probably other trees in the area. Now there's this thing is genetic diversity. There's genetic variability. David has a windrow of Austrian pines planted at the bottom of his nursery. They're all from seeds. They're not from grafts. And if you look, every one of those Austrian pines looks a little bit different. So sometimes you just get a runt, in which case your needles can be short. So maybe another answer is you can compare that most recent growth to growth in the past. You can compare this year's needles to needles last year and needles the year before. You can see, okay, what was my needle elongation? What was my shoot elongation?
All right, thanks, Roman, and thanks everybody for attending. Again, looking at this last slide, if you have any other questions that occur to you or need any help with your trees, you can go ahead and contact Roman here. Also, make sure to stop by Cliff Rose Nursery and support Rick Klesch. He is a great friend and ally. Thank you guys, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.